Hello everyone, this is Brian Reed from NowSecure. We're getting started here on our webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have a few people continuing to log in and there often is a little bit of a delay, so we're going to hold for about a minute to get started. So we'll get started momentarily, but again, this is Brian Reed. I'll be your host and moderator today on our really cool webinar. We have our OWASP and security guru on the phone today, Tony the Tiger Ramirez. He has been doing these every year for us. Each year, Android and iOS go through an update. Tony joins us to give us a rundown on the implications from security, and this year from a privacy perspective with the growing in privacy. So we're going to get started here in a few seconds. Want to make sure that everybody's online that wants to join today, and so we'll be right back. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are, possibly good evening. I know we had Europeans registered, and for those of you in the South Pacific, boy, it's late. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar coming soon, Android Q and iOS 13 privacy enhancements. Sorry for combining those. Pleased today to be joined by our NowSecurity analyst, OWASP guru, pen tester, and more, Tony Ramirez. And I will introduce him and our agenda in just a few seconds. So, a few notes before we begin. So, if you're attending this webinar, you clearly want to learn more about mobile AppSec and the mobile operating systems, as well as things like tools, open source tools, commercial tools, and other tactics to use. So we encourage you to sign up for our bi-weekly DevSecOps newsletter. It's sort of the latest roundup every 2 weeks on all things mobile dev, mobile sec, mobile ops, all stacked together. That's a great way to stay in touch with us. We encourage you to join that and sign up for that newsletter. You can see the subscribe here right below. Today's question, we will have both a presentation and a question and answer session. You can ask a question anytime using the Ask a Question tab on your BrightTalk webinar screen, as you can see here on the screenshot. We encourage you to enter those questions as they occur to you. We will be collecting them at the end. Today we will also be doing polls. We would encourage you to respond to those polls so you and your peers can see your answers to the interesting questions that Tony's put together for us today. Third, today's presentation will be recorded and we will be sending a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording and the slides themselves for your reference. So take notes if you want, but you'll get the recording at the end. Finally, you'll see a rating section in the BrightTalk screen. We really do appreciate when you take the time to fill those in and rate today's presentation. That will help us make sure that we're always creating the best content for you every month. And we got a great agenda today. We are going to take a look at a year in review around Android P and iOS 12. Then we're going to dig into Android Q and iOS 13 and whatever the dessert of the month will be. We've got some great roundup of resources around security testing and some fun predictions as well on the go forward. So our keynoter today is Tony. Tony, please say hello and introduce yourself.
Hey folks, I'm Tony Ramirez, mobile security analyst for NowSecure, pen testing mobile apps on iOS and Android for a few years now. I've been working in the mobile security space for about half a decade, so always excited to talk about it.
So Tony is one of our great guys. He's been working a lot with the OWASP organization and OWASP documents. You'll see him speaking at events, and he's just got a plethora of knowledge and information to share today. So I'm just going to kind of get us started with scope. We had an event, NowSecure Connect 19, earlier this summer with a lot of customers and open source tooling makers and researchers, and you know, it's pretty stunning today that there's over 4 million apps running on 2.6 billion devices. And obviously, if you're joining us today, you're either on the app dev side building those apps, or you're on the security side trying to help secure and test those apps. So we do see this challenge in the growth of apps with the need to grow security. We're happy to partner with Google and Apple and with all of you as developers and security professionals to really kind of continue to raise the bar. We think that really starts by sharing a good perspective on security and risk patterns that happen as we release each new operating system, as well as great new features that you can take advantage of in using those, which we'll get to today. I was on stage yesterday and had done a roundup of what's going on in the world, and it's been kind of a crazy year when we look at what happened in the last year around mobile. You didn't always hear about mobile app risks or vulnerabilities. You periodically heard about malware, but it's been a tough year for mobile AppSec, and so really our goal is to help everyone raise the bar here in their knowledge and understanding of how best to code applications and how best to test applications, especially as iOS and Android evolve every year with their major updates, because we don't want any of you to get caught in any of these nasty actions or scenario. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Tony to get us started. Tony.
Thank you, Brian. Let's start off with talking about what happened last year, and that means talking about Android Pie 9. To begin with, there were a couple major changes from the app side. Specifically, we had kind of some enhancements in terms of how TLS was going to be handled in Android P, and that meant the network security config kind of getting more of an enforcement on Android P. TLS is now the default in Android P. The other thing that came into play was client-side encryption for backups, which is something you could enforce through the XML. So if your app does require backups, you can encrypt those backups and have that required. Again, and that would be client-side encryption. So it's relying on your device PIN, however you're authenticating to the device. And for most people, that's PIN. On top of that, they added some privacy features around how applications can access things like camera and telemetry and like the gyroscope that's on the device. And basically, an application that's in the background can access that. So if you're using, an application like I don't know, the like FaceTime apps that they include with Android, and you're on the call with somebody and you decide to go put that app in the background, they're going to know because that automatically turns off. They might know that you don't have your attention. But from a privacy standpoint, that's pretty great because you don't want an application in the background being able to record your voice or your face, and that's just a scary thing. But probably the biggest change, which was actually kind of a simple thing, was they now have a target SDK requirement. And why is that such a big deal? Well, if you're developing apps back in the day, you could target any version of Android that you wanted to. A lot of people, malware writers specifically, were just writing for older versions so they could bypass the permission requirements and get around a lot of these other issues. Well, you can't do that anymore. So it was great back in this fall. If you were writing apps, you had to target Android, whatever came before P, which is O. So if you weren't targeting Oreo in the fall, you weren't going to be able to update on the App Store. Guess what's going to happen this fall? You got to target Android P. What that means is if you're declaring things like, you're using HTTP in your app, you're going to have to declare that in the network security config. And I wrote up a nice little blog piece about this about almost a year ago, talking about how you can, look at network security config, things to consider, things it does and things it doesn't do. Highly recommend checking it out because that is going to be a requirement for you fairly soon. On the iOS side, things were a little bit more around device security and network security, and less around actual app security. So one of the major changes was certificate transparency being enforced on the devices. This wasn't actually part of iOS 12, but just part of iOS in general, and that happened right around September of last year. Same with the semantic distrust. So if you had a semantic cert on your backend servers and your app started failing, it was probably because you didn't hear about this. Semantic was, dropped as a trusted CA by iOS. In fact, I think it's been dropped by all the other major platforms like Chrome and Android and Mozilla. So, if you're not aware of this right now, you may want to try visiting your website and making sure it actually works because it might have some problems. The major security enhancements, though, came out of WebKit. WebKit is the utility that's used to render, web data. So, if you're using Safari or you're using, the WK Web Views, you're really relying on WebKit to render that content securely. And some of the things that are great about it is they've added some new flags to kind of prevent a lot of these attacks, like like speculative execution attacks and things like that, and these reroute attacks can be really handled by these header flags that they're starting to add. And not only WebKit has added these, but like a lot of the other browsers and other security organizations are using these. So there's things worth looking into. The final one, which later on I think is kind of funny that they put a ton of resources into this one. I think it's a good thing they did, but password manager. iOS had rolled out their password manager in the previous version, but they started allowing it to be used in WK Web Views and other spots. And password manager is a good security feature to have, but I still kind of think in retrospect it's kind of funny that they added it in last year. So we've got a poll. Brian, what's our first poll? Yep. So I think we lost Brian, but our first poll is going to be.
I'm back.
Are you
I'm back. Sorry, I was talking.
Go ahead.
Talking on mute. My apologies, Tony. Here I am staring at a phone with the mute on. So our first poll here really is: what are you planning to do around targeting Android Pie coming out soon? So are you targeting it now? Are you planning on it? You don't know. I'm going to open the poll for you here. So start voting is up and running. So we got a number of folks on the phone here. We're interested in how far along you are in your planning. So are you already there, currently targeting it on Pi? Are you still thinking about it, right? Because we've got an aging cycle here going on as we move into the next version. Some organizations move really fast to take advantage of new releases. Others are still kind of go through the planning cycle and phase it in as well. Tony, I assume you've seen kind of a mixed bag out there of people targeting Pi already or not.
Yeah, we're starting to see a lot more apps in like the financial institutions and those heavily regulated territories. I think it's a good thing. I think if you're effectively using the features in Android Pie, you're making a really secure app. And what's great about like that network security config that is being leveraged more heavily in Pi, it was actually introduced way back in Android 7, but can be used all the way back, I think, through even 5. So if you're using that feature, you're really enhancing app security for a huge set of apps.
Absolutely. All right, let's see where we got results here. So we'll do the stop voting. It kind of looks like we got about 40% are there already. Interesting to see the 30% that don't know. So organizations sometimes move very quickly to support new versions, sometimes take a little bit longer. And so what we'll do is we'll move on here, Tony. That was very interesting results. And have a look at Android Q. Here it comes.
So Android Q came with a lot of changes. We'll get to which one I think is the biggest. But we'll start off with kind of the smaller ones and the obvious ones. Specifically, CBC is kind of getting dumped out of Android. I think a lot of people are starting to try to get away from CBC, using it as part of their Cypher suite. What Android did was kind of drop all uses of it. They had dropped SHA-1, so anything that has like SHA-2 and CBC is kind of dropped out now. They're opting for GCM if you can use it. The other thing is TLS 1.3 support was added in this version. It wasn't added in the previous version. iOS actually had added it in the previous version. I'm a little surprised they didn't add it in P, but it's going to be part of Q. The other thing is they're not going to add support for the 0RTT. If you're not familiar with this, this is kind of just like a session refresh token. A lot of people have questions around it, and it's interesting, and I think because there's so many questions around it, it might be a good thing to have it disabled for right now. On top of that, some restricted access has been added to this file called the procnet file. If you're unfamiliar with Android, procnet file basically kind of gives you information about the connection statuses that are happening on the device. Depending on the type of application you're running, that's useful information. For instance, a VPN app really needs to know connection statuses because it wants to make sure that it's routing your information properly. But this file in general is kind of like an overprivileged access location. So, limiting who can access that location is a good thing, and now you're expected to access either these network stat manager or connectivity manager classes for actually performing that kind of checkup. And mostly we won't really want to see VPN apps do that. I'm sure there's other use cases where that might make sense, but the one that really comes to mind is like a VPN app. There's some other stuff too in terms of data identifiers. Data identifiers are things like tokens or non-resettable values on your device. So the perfect three that come to mind are MAC address, the Android ID, and IMEI. All of those values can't be reset on your device because they're basically physically coded on there. And what Android has done is they've given you the option to use spoofed versions of that. For the IMEI and Android ID, that's actually kind of been in there for a while, but now they're really kind of putting the hammer down. So if you're calling those older versions of those classes, you might get flagged in Android Studio and say, hey, use this thing instead. With MAC address, if you're calling a MAC address, it's going to give you a random value instead. And really, these are great privacy enhancements because limiting the ability for some third party to identify your device in a unique way really isn't something you want tracked. So the other thing that are, with every version of Android, they're adding new protections to prevent malware-based attacks, preventing your data from being exfiltrated, and there's some really interesting ones that were added in this version. One thing that's been kind of interesting to a lot of people in the past was clipboard access. If you're not familiar with what the clipboard is in Android, if you've ever done like a copy-paste function within an app, you're using the clipboard. That is clipboard access. On older versions of Android, every application that's running on your device always has access to the clipboard. It's a little frightening. So what they've done is they've limited it. Basically, only the app in focus has access to it, and the default IME, which is like your keyboard, whatever you're using to enter data. This is interesting from 2 points of view. Number one, if you have apps that are actually performing those kind of attacks, it's going to hinder them. But it kind of makes creating malware that acts as a keyboard kind of more of a lucrative thing if this is the kind of attack thing they want to do. Because again, this is originally not a restricted task to do, but it is something that can be done. But in general, you should try to prevent your users from copying fields, like password fields, within your app. Another one that was added was the ability to launch activities from the background. This has been restricted, and actually this is like a really great thing to do because that's a really frequent activity that malware is going to do. It is going to attempt to launch activities from that background. So just to be clear, like, again, this is a good thing. If your app does launch activities from the background or launches itself, that really doesn't make sense. Apps should really only be launched by something the user does. Another thing is there's been a restriction on untrusted apps, and I think this is really kind of a really nice feature because I think a lot of people are tempted to install apps from untrusted app stores or untrusted locations. So treating how execution is performed by those apps differently is great. And what they actually did is there's some function calls you can do to execute code directly from from like the private app data folder, which is data. If you ever test like apps or do any like forensic analysis on applications. So preventing that kind of action is really nice because it's basically preventing malware from executing code that wasn't included in the original bundle, because it's a really common activity for apps to just download code after they've executed and then run that code. The final one is a little bit more heavy. This is a little bit weirder, and this is still like a function that's in beta. And it's kind of funny because it's kind of going back to like what's old is new. Basically now Android is allowing you to choose when you want your code to be compiled. You could view this as running the code directly from the DEX files. So back in the day before ART, the current Android runtime machine was created, you had to do just-in-time compilation. And that wasn't the most efficient way to do things. And they switched to what's called AOT, which is ahead-of-time compilation, which led to way more efficient app usage. But one thing that malware is capable of doing is if it gets access to that post-compiled data that was compiled ahead of time, it could modify that code and cause a bunch of issues for applications. So now you have the option to choose between JIT and AOT. Of course, be aware that that'll probably be a big performance hindrance on your application, but it does add value. On the Android permission front, we've seen a couple kind of major changes, specifically in like location, and we're going to see this again in iOS as well. Basically, now you have the permission to either only give permission when the app is in the foreground, or when the app is in the background, or you can just deny completely. This is nice because really you only might want the application to have access to your location when you're using it. For some applications, you may want to end up having to give it always access, and that may make sense for an application that does something like maps, where it makes sense that that app has location all the time, but some other apps, you probably don't want it to have your location all the time. Another thing that came out was how the camera permission is treated. There's a lot of sensor data that goes along with the camera permission, and if you're going to be tracking a lot of these like lens-specific things, you're going to need to get the camera permission now. It seems kind of silly, but it actually is kind of an impact on privacy, and it probably will require some changes for certain apps to actually access those permissions. On top of that, this is kind of an interesting one because the access find location permission is going to be required for doing certain types of actions within the telephony, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth APIs. So like if you're doing like network scanning or telephony scanning or Bluetooth scanning, those are things some applications will do to obtain your find location. So you might have heard like, there's access course location and there's access find location. I think the difference kind of makes sense. But find location is just trying to specifically figure out where your location is, and it's using these other instruments on the device to kind of figure that out. So having a permission for those and having kind of more of a higher requirement to get access to that is a good thing. It increases privacy in mobile applications. The biggest one is Android scope storage. This isn't a new feature per se. Scope storage has been something that's been in Android for a few versions now. But basically, what they're going to be doing is today applications can write to the emulated storage or the external storage without permission. If they want to view other files within the external storage, they have to get the external storage permission. They're kind of going to put some restrictions on that, where you still have to get the permission to read and write to there, but you're only going to have a filtered view, and you're only going to be able to view your own application data. If you want to access things like pictures, videos, downloads, you're going to have to do it through a media store class call. The issue, though, is that while this sounds like, oh, this is like restrictions, this is going to prevent attacks that people have been calling man-in-the-disk attacks, there's ways to opt out of it. So it's kind of like, well, it sounds like a cool idea, but not everyone has to follow the rule. So if they don't follow the rule, these attacks can still exist. On top of that, there are certain types of applications that, are basically required to have that permission because they do things like they're a file explorer and they're for sending and receiving files. So like you may have like a document management tool on your device, and you want to be able to view everything that's on the, that emulated storage SD card. So there's this permission called Action Open Documentry, and that's basically going to be kind of a legal permission depending on what app uses it. So that's one you're going to want to be aware of because, again, that can affect your app and impact it in a pretty negative way if it is a malicious app. And kind of to end off, there's kind of some interesting stuff that might point to, future things that'll come in to Android and iOS, in Android specifically, sorry. Specifically, these Android Go devices, if you're not familiar with them, they're kind of Android devices that are stripped down, meant to run more efficiently, and they can run the most modern OS. Those devices on Android Q will not give the SAW permission, which is the system overlay window permission. So if you're familiar with this, a lot of applications will kind of do overlays. One that's common is like the Facebook chat messenger app that uses like an overlay and it gives you like that little bubble. Well, they're not enabling it on the Go devices. They say it's for like efficiency reasons to kind of cut down on battery usage and CPU usage. But I think that does kind of have a nice privacy impact. And there's always been talk about turning that permission into like a requested permission where the user has to acknowledge that an application is going to do that. The other end of that is, like we might start seeing that in future devices, and that'd be pretty cool, but we'll see. Another one we came across is this Google Maps is getting an incognito mode, which is kind of interesting. If you want to prevent somebody who has access to your phone from knowing your previous location, there's a couple ideas where somebody might want to use that. But what's interesting about that is maybe we'll see apps in the future that have like the Google sign-on use the incognito mode. So you may want to use that application, but you don't want to log in with your account because you don't want it to retain any of your data, or you don't want it to be linked with your account. It'd be cool if those apps offered an incognito mode, and that may be a future thing. The other thing that's coming out too is, and I really like this one, it's a warning system for older versions of apps. So if you're downloading an app and it's on an older version of the SDK because it's just kind of grandfathered in and it hasn't updated in like a year and a half now, you're going to get a warning message, and it's going to show you like, hey, this is running an older version of an app. The minimum they're calling is SDK 22, which 22 was before they actually required the app developer to have the user acknowledge that you're using that permission and actually request for that permission. That's kind of a cutoff where I think like if your app is on that lower version and doesn't request for those permissions, it could potentially be malicious, because that kind of is a shortcut for malware. And that's one to keep an eye on, because I think that's a really great privacy feature to add in your app. And if you're in security, you want your devices to be updated, you want your apps to be updated, you want to be targeting the most recent SDKs. So making your users aware that they're using older versions is great. The next one I want to cover is kind of a weirder one. A lot of people are interested in overlay. In the last version of Android, they added this feature where it would tell you if your device is being overlaid. But there's still attacks that have gotten around that. If you're interested in finding out more about overlay, you should read this paper called Cloak and Dagger. And Android actually has some reports on overlay. It actually has some flags that can detect overlay. Specifically, this one called Flag Window is obscured. But now they're adding a new one called Flag Window is partially obscured. So if something on the app screen is partially obscured and it detects it, it's going to notify you with a Boolean flag. It's still in beta. I've heard some stories that it doesn't work all the time, or it's still being tested. But this was before the beta 5, so it'd be interesting to see how this works today. It might be interesting to see like you finally have a way to detect those overlay attacks, and you have a way to kind of remediate them. It'll be interesting to see how that's handled. The final one is contact affinity. So applications that had access to contacts used to be able to actually tell, like, okay, this contact is related in this relationship, because you can set, like, oh, this is my mother, this is my father, this is my cousin, this is my sister. Apps no longer have access to that information, and really that is nice because, again, it's a nice little privacy feature.
Alrighty, time for the next poll, and I love this one. So, what will Android Q stand for? So we've been living in the land of desserts, but there is not necessarily the most obvious one for the letter Q. So we came up with some ideas here. We're interested in what you think. Queso I think is my choice, but I don't know if they'll go for an appetizer or not. Tony, what are your thoughts on this? I think one of these might be yours, actually.
Well, I like cucumber because it's far-fetched enough that they would do it. But my theory is Google's going to make a candy, and they're going to release it with the final release of Android Q.
Oh, that's hilarious. That would be funny. So Google gets into the candy business, partner with somebody or otherwise. So what kind of candy is cucumber going to be, or whatever candy they make? I think
I think a cucumber candy, I think people would eat that. I think, cucumber and lemon, cucumber and mint flavored candy. That might be interesting.
I guess you can get like a cucumber vodka lime type drinks now. I don't know what they're called, so I could see that.
Oh.
I don't know. If Google made a candy, what would it be? Google made a candy. It wouldn't be chocolate. I think it'd be like a hard candy.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
Or chewy candy, not like a chocolate bar. So we'll just have to see what they come up with. So all right, get your votes in. We're gonna go see what the world thinks. So stop voting. We see there's a tie between cucumber and quiche. So more than one person likes your idea there, Tony. I appear to be the only person who picked queso. So we'll see what happens. Appreciate you that. We'll be back and make sure we tweet it out, and we'll hear before too long what it's actually going to be and see what object winds up in the lawn at the Googleplex. And so with that, I'll hand it back to you, Tony. Let's talk about 13. Mr. iOS 13's around the corner.
All right, 13, lucky number 13 for iOS. I kind of thought they were going to skip 13, but they didn't. Getting into iOS, major permission changes. They actually did exactly the same thing as Android, as it turns out. If you're going to, ask for the location permission now, you're basically forced to ask for, does the user want to use it once, or do they want to use it while in use? In a way, this is better than the way Android did it, because Android's basically saying foreground or everything or nothing. Android now has basically four, where, once, while in use, always, or never. But again, the catch is you're going to have to ask for one of those first two before you can get all the time permission. And again, for the same reasons, it's kind of nice on Android. It's nice on iOS. Preventing somebody from accessing your permission all the time is kind of a nice feature. It makes sense. Another one that kind of seems small and minuscule is for purpose strings. If you're doing iOS development, you're probably familiar with purpose strings because they're kind of important on iOS. They're basically telling why you're using that permission. Before you did small things like this, I think, are a big impact for users because they're an effective way to have the developer explain why they need access to that. And I think being able to explain why those things are important for the app's runtime, helps them determine what decisions they should make in terms of their own privacy. And hopefully they make good decisions. On the network security enhancement side, TLS 1.3 is now on by default. It is the default use case for network. TLS is the default version now. 1.3 is the default version of TLS. There we go. That's better. On the other side, there's going to be some kind of stricter requirements on certifications or certs on iOS, and I'm talking about network certs. For instance, now you're required to have a cert. If it's using RSA, the RSA key has to be larger than 2048. No more SHA-1 sign certs. This is probably the biggest one because it leads to a lot of issues, and it's probably going to lead to a lot of broken hostname verification issues in applications. But common name versus using the SNI, I think this is kind of the most hand-wavy one where you want to make sure you're doing hostname verification. Which part of the cert are you inspecting? Make sure you're inspecting the SNI. Make sure you're creating certs that are properly configured, that the subject alternative name is your host name. Be aware of that. This could be a problem. This is going to be enforced in the fall, so just be aware of that again. Probably the coolest feature that came out of WWDC that's still in beta is CryptoKit. I think it's tied for the coolest feature. But basically, what iOS did was they decided they were going to roll out a new enhanced version of the Common Crypto Library to run in Swift. It's easier to use. In the video presentation, what was cool was they showed something that used to take 100 lines of code can now be done in 10. You can set this up so that it relies on the secure enclave for saving your private keys. Really good for doing public key encryption too. And what's nice too is they've kind of done a nice curated version of like what's good crypto, and if you're going to use weak crypto, you still can use it, but you have to call this insecure module. So from like a code review side, that's actually pretty nice to actually explicitly call something insecure within the source code if you're going to use it. The two that are actually flagged out are MD5 and SHA-1. CBC is not even included in the list, so it might get added later on as an insecure module. But by default, they really want you using GCM. They want you using that like good elliptic curve cryptography that everyone says you should be using, and there's just good practices in there. But here's the catch. You need to be aware that these things aren't meant to replace the current functionalities in the OS. So, make sure you're using NS file protection classes properly. Make sure you're using that network framework. Make sure you're using NS app transport security, because these things are all, really good tools to make your app more secure. What they give as examples when you might use the CryptoKit is maybe you have like a secure container that needs to be stored within the app, or maybe your app has some kind of signing process where it has to validate some key at some point. And they give kind of like two example apps where like maybe you have an app that has a paid feature, so you have to have a signing in there because you want to actually authenticate that this user actually did make that payment, and there's some mechanism built into the app that allows to validate that process. And on the flip side, another example might be like peer-to-peer payments, where you want to make sure that those peer-to-peer payments can't be manipulated or changed. So even if somebody does bypass like certificate pinning or something, they have to bypass like public key encryption or HMAX to get around to actually changing that API. And that's a higher level of work than just throwing that in the TLS tunnel and just saying it's good enough. The other major one, and this one is going to lead to some interesting things in the future, is sign in with Apple. It's Apple's SSO. What it does is it ties with your Apple ID, so whatever email is associated with that, it's going to tie in with that. And probably the biggest thing that's crazy about it is it's going to be required for all third-party apps that already have an SSO feature in them. That's crazy. That's huge. It's still in beta, and they're saying that sometime this summer they're going to start releasing the code base and how you can do it, and there's already some stuff out there. But it'll be interesting to see how apps implement this. There's actually some really cool features in it too. They're touting that it's a more privacy-centric SSO. We'll see. We'll have to find out. But what's really cool is Apple is basically kind of tracking if it's a real user or not, and they're basically supplying like, is this a valid user? Is this not a valid user? And if your application has a CAPTCHA process for enrollment, what's nice is you can actually just call on this like authentication class to actually verify that the user is a real user, and Apple will tell you, yeah, this is probably a real user. The other cool feature is this fake email address one. I think this one's actually gotten like a lot of press, but basically you can associate a fake email address with your Apple ID. So when you do set up an account with like some service, it'll relay all the messages directly back to you. And that's actually kind of nice because let's say there's big like data dump of a bunch of like your usernames and passwords, and they can't associate it with your real email address, and they can only associate with that fake email address. And any messages that are sent to that fake email address are going to just be relayed to your real one, and on top of that, they're not retained by Apple. So again, kind of a nice privacy feature. Maybe Android will do that in the future. I think that's actually kind of a cool thing. We'll see how it plays out. But again, interesting. Finally, the other enhancements, iPad OS. There really isn't much information around it. It's still like brand spanking new. We'll see how much of a change it is, but it's kind of bringing some desktop features to iPad. They're planning on offering some like hardware peripherals that can be included in your device. Overall, it's kind of interesting, but I think it's still too new to know what's going to come along with that. I think there already are a lot of developers who have separate iPad versions from their normal iOS apps. So, this might be better for them. If you're already developing an iOS app and you're worried because, you have an iPad version of it, but it's effectively the same, chances are it's probably not going to be a huge impact, but it may incentivize you to have, an iPad version of your app. We'll see. The other thing is stricter guidelines on the app review side. iOS allows you to kind of mark data if it's like healthcare data, or if it's like data like you have a smartwatch and that smartwatch tracks certain health credentials about you. They've already kind of required you to label that data, but now if your application is going to share that data with like a third-party source, you have to make the user aware before you do that. And really, like, the idea that kind of is guided behind that is something like an insurance app where, that application might want to track your like health status because maybe you get like a lower insurance rate if you get like 10,000 steps per day or something on average. There's a bunch of scenarios where that makes sense, and there's a bunch of scenarios where it doesn't make sense. So again, kind of tracking how that data is used is a good thing. And they've kind of done that with like most data that's being used in the device. You might notice that like the sources of data that your app can use within the app is kind of being regulated now. So like loading external databases, it's kind of being treated differently. And that guideline 516 or 7, that one's a little bit confusing, and there still needs to be a little more information around it. But just basically the sources of data you're loading within the app from a third party kind of have to be managed in a special way, I guess, now. On the flip side, if your application is going to collect data about you, the app must receive consent. That's great. I think any time where you're forcing the user to consent that your data is going to be sent somewhere is a good thing. And again, these are kind of like GDPR-backed requirements. They're not really that surprising. I'm surprised they weren't in the review process last year, but they're good things. The other thing is iOS is going to start supporting WebSockets from a first-party library. If you're developing apps or web apps that rely heavily on WebSockets, and that's always been kind of your qualm of getting them into your like mobile world, you're going to get better WebSocket support now. Again, this is still like a very beta feature, but it'll be interesting to see how this gets fleshed out. All right, Brian, we got another poll.
All righty, Tony here. So I think it's time for our last poll, of course. And so let me get that poll open. Tony, can you click the open button on it? It's not clicking for me here. Try it again here. There we go.
We got it.
Sorry about that. I got it now. All right, so do you plan to have separate features for iOS and iPad OS? It's kind of interesting. We look at the Google market has a degree of fragmentation because all the different manufacturers, they have variations of operating systems for all the different sizes and shapes. And those of you who build Android apps and work on the UX side certainly experience that. It's interesting seeing what's going on in the Apple world as they continue to evolve as well. So we're interested in your thoughts on, I guess it's iOS or traditional iOS versus iPad OS. So do you plan to support it, use it, embrace it, have two builds, and so on and so forth? So encourage you to have a look and help us answer the poll of yes or no. So Tony, what are you thinking about iOS versus iPad OS and what the market may do here?
I think it's really too soon to say, but I do think there's an incentive to have an iPad version of your app for UI purposes. And especially in cases where maybe your app does like media streaming or like document management, totally makes sense, 100%. Because I think a lot of the reason behind this is like peripherals.
Yeah, and certain types of interaction with user content, as you listed there, right? And it certainly seems like they're moving towards this notion of, the iPad is almost a desktop replacement. And so when you get there, there are sort of levels of functionality people may want, and from a user experience perspective that, are a different animal than the smartphone itself, right? Peripherals, I think, are a good one. I think data entry, consumption, navigation, and so on and so forth are interesting as well. So Please get your vote in, and I am going to click the stop. And so it looks like half the world says too soon to say. Only a few folks really looking at it. I think because it's so new and so different. I think some of this is also about, what's the user adoption going to be like and user expectations as things continue to evolve. Is it worth the investment to create a different version of your app because you can have a dramatically improved or functionally differentiating or unique capability? Maybe you invest in it, and if you don't. So watch that and see what happens. Sure, we'll be talking about that next year when we see what happens in terms of adoption. So Tony, let's pull together now that we know what's going on with security and privacy around Android Q and iOS 13. Let's have a look at the testing side of the house. So back to you.
Yep, let's talk bread and butter. On iOS, let's start there. I think where we're going to see a lot of pitfalls is SSO. I think that's obvious. I think SSO, like implementing a new SSO in your application, or even adding SSO in general because now there's a feature to do it through Apple, is going to be interesting because, again, you're basically requiring a ton of apps to add it into their app, or a ton of developers to add it into their app. And, as it is, there's a lot of SSO perils and fails that happen today, and like the apps that are out there right now, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays in. So like if you do SSO testing, kind of brush up because you're going to be doing it a lot for this sign up with Apple. Being wary of WebSockets. I don't think we're going to see a lot of apps with WebSockets right away. Probably not for another year, but be aware. WebSockets sometimes are harder to intercept depending on what tool you're using. Just be aware that might be a new, interesting attack scenario, an interesting location for, data leakages, and, just keep that in mind. The other thing is that CryptoKit. I think there's two things you'll want to be aware of, and it's not using that insecure module. I hope that people will see the word insecure module and think to themselves, hey, maybe I shouldn't use that. But if you're a security analyst and you're doing any, like code review, you know that if there's an easier way to do something, or if there's a way to copy paste it from online, or there's just a document that somebody's been relying on for over 10 years, they're going to opt for that over doing things what might be considered the more secure way or the new way. The other thing is it's important for developers not to try to rebuild the wheel, not try to use CryptoKit to do things that it really shouldn't be intended for, because there's so many things already in iOS for doing, app security and protecting users on like the network side, or using the keychain, or like NSApp transport security, or a ton of other features that I'm kind of brushing over. NS file protection classes. These things are all really useful, and they're really simple to use. And it may be that CryptoKit isn't always necessary in those situations. And even Apple admits it. Like, we built these features to do this, use them. In these other cases, use cryptography. And again, I think what's great is you're getting like a new, like a vetted crypto standard, a crypto library, and a lot of people like to roll out their own crypto, and it's just like the scariest thing in the world. So having a way to do it using a first-party SDK, using first-party frameworks is so important. And overall, just make sure your apps still work on iOS 13, because these network enhancements can really affect your app. They can prevent them from making connections, so be aware of that. On the Android side, I think where you're going to find some interesting problems is, first of all, I think the scope storage is going to be a major change for a lot of developers, and they're going to want to rely on that legacy permission. So if you see that like request legacy external storage true in the XML, that's basically saying like I'm not going to opt for this scope storage, and I'm not going to use the new features. And really, that's not a great thing, because writing to external storage in general isn't good. But I mean, just be aware that if somebody's doing that, this might be an indication that they're doing that. On top of that, if they're doing it, hopefully they'll use the scope storage, and they'll use it in a way where they're not writing sensitive data to the external storage. They're not writing executable code to that external storage. They're only using it maybe to access pictures, because a lot of applications do that. You want to set a profile picture in your app, you got to use those images that are on the SD card. The other thing is that action open document tree. I think that's going to be a permission that we're going to see really commonly in malware as Android Q apps start rolling out. But I mean, this won't be for another year until fall 2020, to be aware of that. Where I think you need to really spend more of your time testing is being aware of these Android 9 features. These Android P features are going to make things complicated if you haven't been aware of them. So, like, you want to make sure that not only are developers going to be forced to target, that higher level SDK 27, but you want to make sure that they're using all the good security features that come along with it, and that means using network security config. And if your application does use backups, make sure that you're enforcing an encryption policy along with that. So I think that's the bigger thing to be aware of, because again, those API, those target SDK requirements are going to come again in this fall. So make sure that you can meet them, because you're not going to be able to update if you don't meet those requirements. And if you are meeting those requirements and not taking advantage of all the security features, you're basically kind of losing value. So we have some predictions. Talked with some people, came together, we kind of talked about what we think might be the things we're going to see in the coming year, maybe next year. Hopefully we'll see some of them. Crackdown on CBC. I think we're going to see CBC kind of get pushed out, no longer being allowed to be used. I think that hopefully in Android R, whatever Android R is going to be called, the enforcement on that scope storage is going to be stronger, and it's not going to be just like something that you can opt into, but rather something that's enforced and that all apps are required. And if you require that special permission, you're going to have to go through a stricter review process. I think that's what's going to happen in a couple of years. Hopefully next year, hopefully not in 2 years. The other thing is, I think this incognito mode is really interesting. If your application already does have like a kind of single sign-on in it, and maybe users don't want to sign in with your single sign-on. I know I don't always want to in every app. Having an incognito mode is really useful, because I don't want to share who I am. I just want to use the app and not have to worry about everything. The other one that I was hoping would come out in this version was kind of some more tweaks around certificate transparency use through the network security config. I think those are going to be interesting things to walk into in future versions of Android, because I think iOS already offers support of certificate transparency through app transport security. So it'd be interesting to see Android do the same. I think there already are classes in Android to do certificate transparency checks on your app during runtime. One library that comes to mind is called Conscript, if you're interested in that. But I think that's going to be a major help to people who are already doing really defense in-depth strategies to prevent themselves from being man in the middle. On the Apple side, I think storage peripherals are going to be a huge thing. We're going to see some interesting things. Maybe we'll see an Apple NAS where only your iPad can access our NAS, and only your iOS devices can access our secure NAS device that you run in your house, and that might be interesting. I think people are going to try to make hardware wallets with using the crypto kit. I think that's going to be a big thing for Apple in the coming year. Maybe we'll see. But I think overall we're just going to see a bunch of SSL mistakes everywhere. I think that's going to be the big thing that's kind of the impact with regards to people doing single sign-on with Apple, because you're probably going to see it in Android apps, and you're not going to be able to use them there. And people are going to go back and they're going to tweak their SSO and make mistakes. And, just having this big of a major change in the App Store might lead to some interesting points. So, Brian, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, we're getting kind of late here on the time, so I'm just going to click through a few resources you all will get afterwards. And really get into some great questions that came through. So we work a lot with the OS standards committees, and Tony himself has been working with the crew on evolving the materials. So we do want to encourage you, as you're looking at your AppSec program, to take advantage of all the resources from OWASP especially take a look at the MASVS and take a run through the MSTG. The Mobile Security Testing Guide is all of 400 pages of a how-to guide, but start with the AppSec verification, which is really building a risk-based model to your testing program. We have a bunch of resources from NowSecure you can use too, so leverage how-to guides and documents on how to set up a mobile AppSec program, really how to evolve from Agile to DevOps and with mobile AppSec as part of DevOps in phased approaches like you would with many other things. And then over 100 pages of mobile development best practices are all available as well. And we find that these resources can often be very helpful to teams as they're planning things. We also encourage you to follow our blog. More recently, one of our researchers posted a piece on Kotlin. They're responding to some scuttlebutt saying, write whatever you want with Kotlin. Testing doesn't matter, just to obfuscate your code. The reality is we showed how obfuscated code could be reversed easily, and that's still then exposed untested apps to risk. So think your way through that. And we do encourage you, while obfuscating and doing other anti-reversing or data protection strategies, still make sure you've actually performed the AppSec testing before you do that. NowSecure works with a lot of organizations. We'd be happy to work with you. So while we're sharing information here, we can also help you with your AppSec testing strategy and products. We do that for a lot of organizations around the world. And, you know, as part of that, then we can help you really gain visibility with automated testing, where you bring static, dynamic, and behavioral together. And, you know, in order to do that, then that gives you that full test by running tests on jailbroken rooted real devices. We're going to be everywhere this fall. If you're in government, we'll see you at ATARC. Black Hat, a lot going on. Our research team is running a 4-day training program on advanced Frida and Radare, along with other events and activities at Black Hat. We're also, for those of you on the DevOps side, over in Jenkins World, we'll be speaking at DroidCon if you're on the Android side. R2Con, our Frida and Radare research teams, and a lot of Frida and Radare users around the world come to R2Con. OWASP as well, their global event has moved up from October to September, and then DevOps in the fall, and all-day DevOps some more in the fall. So lots going on here. So with that, we want to sort of jump over into some of the questions. So let me get digging into the questions side of the house here and start scrolling through them. Looks like a lot came through. So there's a question in here: how do third-party tools work with this execution of untrusted app policy? Tony, you want to get started with that one? Third-party tools?
Yeah.
Third-party tools.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of tools that people rely on that you have to install on the device and are kind of like untrusted apps because of how they're installed. What's nice with most Android features are, you know, they're usually disableable through the developer options, and this is like a perfect example of one. There's more than a few that I listed here today, like the background execution and all that stuff. Those can be disabled, but they require, you know, like being in developer mode. Those are, you know, things to be aware of. So if you're using tools like that, just be aware that, you know, you're going to have to disable those protections when you're running.
So related to that, how do restrictions of untrusted apps affect apps like Dozer and N-Number App Store for Android?
Yeah, I think you're talking from like testing tools, and those are going to be on a testing device. So, you know, make sure when you're configuring your testing device, you're aware that that's a protection that's in place that might affect your ability to test apps, so disable it. I think that's going to be the general solution there. So Brian, I see some good questions here too about people asking kind of about external storage and anti-tamper.
Yep.
And, you know, yeah, writing to external storage is really something you should avoid doing. Even with the scope storage, I think it's a cool feature, but again, you should avoid writing to external storage because it is a unsafe practice. What we see is applications will write executable code to the, you know, emulated storage SD card. They'll write sensitive like JSON files that contain like health information or other things they'll even put firmware updates for like IoT hardware. And because that file can be accessed by other apps, I mean, that's a scary attack policy. So even with the scope storage, it is like a step in the right direction, but they haven't they put the lock on the door, but they didn't click it, close. So hopefully we'll see that in the future version of Android.
Good. What else do you see in here interesting, Tony, as we look through this plethora?
So I'm seeing some questions about like the SDK and just kind of like how screen overlay is being treated. Just be aware, overlay is a functionality within an application that could be used for non-malicious reasons. Like I said, the first example was the Facebook app has that Facebook Messenger app where you can have like the little bubble that shows up on your screen. There's some other apps that do that too that aren't quite coming to mind. I think YouTube does it now where you can have like a little overlay window. So there are perfect examples of where that's not malicious. But there are other cases where applications might do it and try to trick you into thinking they're not there, and they'll try to intercept your actions within that app window. I'll leave it there because we are coming close to the end, and I kind of want to answer some of these other questions too.
Yes, there's actually a question about Kotlin and our support of Kotlin. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm quite familiar. And what's cool is the way we do testing, especially in like our automated environments and just kind of like our IS approach, because we're testing how the app functions on the device. The code base doesn't really matter. Whether you're running, like a Cordova app or Xamarin app or a different type of framework. There's like a billion under the sun now. Just because of our app testing approach, those things don't affect our ability to get full coverage. And that's really the magic of kind of doing our dynamic testing.
Got it. Actually, there's another testing question while you're in there, which is, are we able to test and manage root detection? Things like that.
So I'll give this one up pretty quickly. The thing to be aware of is both platforms, and I think you're specifically talking about Android. You're asking specifically about like how to do root detection there. If you're really interested in doing effective root detection, I highly recommend checking out Google Safety Net API because they offer some really good ways to do that. iOS doesn't have a first-party way to do that. Just be aware of that. For jailbreak detection, they don't really have a supported SDK, but Google's Safety Net attestation API is awesome.
Good stuff. So with that, we've got a few seconds before we are done. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. There were more questions here. We will try to get answers back to you all. A reminder that we will have a recording